All right, hello everybody. Thanks for coming, first of all. My name is Evgeny. I work at Fannie Mae as a front-end developer mostly. My background is I have a full stack. I used to work on a back end for some time. Now it just happens that I work on a front end. Love it. Also, I recently started contributing to NgRx Store open source. It's great. Community is great too. If you guys ever think about it, just do it. We always need help, and start with documentation, little things, and then you can contribute more once get around it. Also, I write for Angular in depth. That's one of very popular blogs out there for Angular. I've just started recently, so I have few posts only, but that's something which I like to do in my spare time. All right, NgRx. How many of you guys actually use it in your? Wow. Okay, so a lot of people actually know about it, so it's great. I didn't really know the audience level, so I have a lot of introduction information. So just let me know if you want to speed up pace or something. So I don't need to go maybe in details, but for people who don't use it or know about it, I'm probably gonna just show few slides. Okay, so I try to go into first about my app which I work on. I can't really, unfortunately, disclose the name or a lot of internals about it. It's not really publicly advertised yet at Fannie. Basically, in essence, this is the trading app. It's based on Angular 7, pretty standard modules here. You probably guys all use it. NgRx Store. We started using NgRx Store pretty much back in 2017, I think, when I originally started, designing and architecting the app. And ever since, I was really happy with it. I'm never really, at the beginning, you probably face the same issue, like the learning curve is pretty steep. So the concepts of reactive programming, if you on top of that you need to learn Reks.js at the same time, it's can be challenging. At least for me, it was crazy. And plus at that time it wasn't really much documentation, so it was a little bit tough. However, everything which I'm gonna talk about here, my opinion is probably biased towards using NgRx. So it's pretty opinionated tool, and I'm gonna get about it in a little bit more details. But when you need to use it, I'll have a particular slide about it, so you can actually make the decision for yourself. Maybe if you have any questions, you can ask them after. For guys who don't use it, which we have 2 or 3 people here, right? Karma adjustment, nothing crazy here. We use unit testing and pretty standard tools here. Okay, the app itself. We have few user types, like external clients, internal clients, then they have a few roles. So pretty much we have just only 2 interfaces. Users on one interface, they initiate request. User on other end of the wire, they receive the request and they act upon it. Basically, they need to either reject or accept or add a price to a particular transaction, right? So it's pretty live. The user which creates the request, it's created over HTTP. The user which waits over there for that request, it's delivered via WebSockets through the broker. The nature of the app is again, pretty chatty, right? So one transaction lives for about 2 minutes. So if nothing happens to it, it expires. So there can be back and forth between sides for 10, 15 times or one transaction. So you can imagine how much data and how much state change happening. It pretty overwhelming when you kind of need to store that and make some sense of it when all that happens. So that's why NgRx is really great in situations like that. And again, it's not that one. So basically, external client they initiate only a single request at a time. However, internal clients, they get all those requests as a queue. So they need to act up on those guys in first in, first out order. That's pretty much the app. So for guys who don't know, what's NgRx? Besides the weird acronym, it is a state management tool, which is, the quote is taken from official NgRx documentation. By the way, if you guys don't use the ngrx.io, I strongly encourage you to. It's amazing. Lately, pretty much like all the features and all the modules of NgRx are covered. So, yeah, you can read it for yourself. NgRx is not just the store anymore. It's a suite of tools, and it consists of the store itself. It's RxJS powered library, which is inspired by Redux. I'm not sure if you guys work on React apps. State management is all about Redux in React world. I mean, I've never worked on React, but that's what I know. And this library is written using the conventions and approaches from Redux. Something which is delivered outside of the store itself, like I mean, at least the npm module is separate and it's not part of the actual core module, is effects. However, I don't really know if you having a real web application can avoid using effects. I'm not sure you guys can answer. I'm pretty curious because it's pretty embedded in NgRx methodology, and any side effect you need to manage, it's done with effects. So it's not really clear to me why they put it outside of NgRx Store. They had their own reasons probably. Store dev tools, we don't use it. However, I've heard a lot of good things about it. The reason why I don't do it, it's probably awesome. On corporate machines, no for all like extensions and stuff, so I need to get like a specific approval for that, which I wasn't really lucky about yet. So, but I mean, I checked it on my personal machine. It looks great. You can play back and forth the entire application, state by state, action by action. So, strongly encourage you. Router store is something we don't use either, but it's something where if you ever need to keep the entire like history of your story, router changes for like user, you can probably use it and then have that information for your, I mean, if you need it. That's what I think it is. Entity is just a way to manage your collections in a more efficient way, so you don't don't end up writing your own methods for retrieving element from the list or adding, or so they have their own adapter with like all the stuff you can use, which is, I checked the code, it's pretty efficient and really performant. So that's just another layer of abstraction, right, on the stuff, the core stuff which they have. And the NgRx data is part of which was added in version 8. We didn't use it, we didn't update to Angular 8 yet, but you guys can check it out. It's something which adds you, like, makes it easier for you to create standard reducers, actions, and effects for like particular entity. Like make some kind of like a CRUD operation that you can use it, but if you need to produce some specific stuff, maybe you need to. That's not going to be covered by NgRx data, but that's what it is for. And schematics is same thing. If you have ever used it in Angular, you can generate your reducers, actions, and effects. These three guys, for guys which don't know what NgRx is, I'm going to go after a little bit later. So yeah, schematics is just generating the tool to generate your code for entities. So what is application state? Why it's important? Why it's so popular? Like every meetup, I mean not meetup, but conference, Angular conference. Every time you go to an Angular conference, there's always somebody talking about state management, because it's kind of complicated. If you have a really busy application like we do, or you have a lot of components which need to talk to each other, modules, kind of get off track if you need to have like a store which shared between components and then updated from different services. So that's what application state is. It's basically the local data of your user, which is not necessarily sent back to the server, which you kind of need to preserve or cache for your own needs. I mean, if you need to use it later. Any form values. Let's say we had a really good example, and this is again opinionated, but a lot of people go against storing any form data in NgRx Store. We do it. No issues with it for us. We just don't overuse it. Basically, there are different, like let's say when internal clients, they act on one of the transaction, they add some price in there, but then they flipped to others thing, and then we need to preserve that stuff in the previous trade. When, let's say, state updates for that previous trade, it just clears if you don't store the data in the form in the NgRx Store. So this is when we use NgRx Store and pretty successfully to manage like all the collection form values in the store. And of course the router navigation data, which I went over again. Again, really quick, why NgRx Store? First of all, if you want to be able to go back and forth, right, in your application to kind of replay entire state, what happened from point A to point B and then all the way back, this is what NgRx Store is. It makes your data serializable so that you can store this data in any external client you wish. You can use local storage, or you can even save it to the database, maybe if you need it. So it makes it really easy. Testability. NgRx is written using all the methodologies and approaches of functional programming. So most of their entities are pure functions. So it's pretty easy to test it. Unit tests, you always expect same output for same input, so it's a piece of cake, right? And I'm not sure about you, but I'm not a big fan of unit testing, but I mean, yeah, scratch that. I love it. It's just, maybe I'm not a big fan of TDD, okay? Everybody has to have some unit testing coverage, right? Unless you test intersect with end-to-end testing, but that's a different conversation. But believe me, like NgRx makes it like a charm. Like if you need to test any selector or reducer, it's so easy because it doesn't have any side effects. Like you don't need to worry about anything. You just assert one value. It's always going to be there if you do everything correctly. Performance. NgRx Store, right? It's all about immutability. Why immutability is important? Because V8 JavaScript engine, it's really performant and it really works fast on comparing the object references, right? When it's trying to check for like say same objects by value, it needs to go down by all this nested objects. They get huge, and if they need to check the particular properties which is set or unset, it just gets so slow and so complicated. So you guys ever heard of like Angular change detection on push? So if you ever use it and then this is when NgRx shines, basically, because everything which you do in your reducer, you always want to think about not mutating your state, right? You always create a deep copy of your current state and then you return it to the, that's going to be like a new copy of that current state plus the thin, and then plus the action payload, and then it reduces it to the new state, which is a deep copy, never mutated object. So that if your component subscribed to that slice of NgRx Store, and you use an on push, it will always propagate that value, because if you mutate your change and you use an on push strategy, it will not get triggered. That's why it's so important to do it. That's about performance. We actually, Angular in depth, I wrote about performance like a few weeks ago, and it was exactly about this problem we had, but not with on push, but some other things. But as far as NgRx and the way it's working, it's great. It was just other things, not related to NgRx Store, but actually ng4 loop was just doing some crazy stuff because of huge lists. So, but that's something else. Also encapsulation. Obviously your state exists outside of your Angular store, Angular application, right? So a lot of good stuff right after this. It's not intermingled or anything. It's just there. You always have access to it. You always have unidirectional flow to it. You always know how to update it, and you always know how to listen for updates. So something to remember. How are we doing on time? Okay. This is interesting. Again, for people new to NgRx, right? There is a lot of blog posts about when should I use NgRx, why would I need it? Because it's really for new people who are not familiar with reactive programming. It's mind blowing. Like they don't want to do it. It seems counterproductive, but just a few things to consider. Guys from NgRx core team came up with this Shari principle, acronym, right, for 5 words. So basically, you may consider using it, right, if your state is shared, which is pretty obvious for like most big apps, right? If you always have some kind of list or like object, like let's say profile data, which you need to have access from different components or services. Your state is hydrated. Basically, again, about that serializability. Sorry, serializability. When you want to save it in some external storage and then kind of like get that cache and hydrate it back to the application. This is when NgRx great, because there are a few runtime flags. I'm not sure when they were added. Probably, yeah, I'm not sure which version, but they have this 4 strict flags you can set for immutability and serializability for both reducers and actions, and it will enforce your app to be immutable and serializable. Again, it depends. Maybe with actions you don't really need that, but again, depends. So you want to play with those. Again, if your state needs to be available when you change the routes, again, if it needs to be retrieved with a side effect, and we're going to talk about side effects a little bit later, and if it's impacted. So again, if it's shared between components, and if it's impacted from different components, but from different services or components. Again, really quick about Redux principles. That's what NgRx follows, and React developers are familiar with. Single source of truth, right? It's pretty straightforward, because since we have this single store which lives outside of app, it means that the single source of the data lives in the NgRx Store, and you don't really need to fetch anything else. You always go to store to get that particular slice at a particular time. And state is read-only, as I said. Immutability, right? You never mutate it for a few reasons. For performance, I guess primarily for performance. Oh yeah, and for so you can replay your state, right? It's always a new copy of the previous, deep copy of the previous state. And pure functions, right? Always no side effects, same input gives the same output. Okay, key concepts. For people who heard about NgRx but never used it, this is probably going to be interesting, but I mean, people who know about it, just bear with me. I think actions is the most important concept of NgRx, and if you think about action, right, it's, first of all, it has to be unique, so that you can, for login purposes, so you always know where it originated from. And these actions or events, right, they're being dispatched from either component or service or anywhere else where you need to perform your state change, right? You always dispatch an action which has some information about the state which needs to be updated. Okay, reducer is the heart of the NgRx store, right? It's what actually performs the change of your state. That's called reducer. It was pretty, like, I don't know if you guys, English is not my first language, so it was hard for me to understand why it's called reducer. But it looks like, I mean, there's JavaScript function, reduce, right, which does pretty much the same thing. It just gets the current state and then the current value, and then just you can do something with it. So you kind of reduce it to something new. So I guess that's why it's reducer, which, I mean, why is it reducer? Because it's not, reduce to me is something which gets smaller, right, but not necessarily gets smaller. So, yeah.
It's not a language problem. I don't know why they call it reducer.
So, yeah, fancy word, I guess, right? If you talk about reducer, people think that it's, yeah, way smarter. Anyways. And selectors. Again, pure functions. They are really helpful for you to create a collection of let's say you have a state which has few substates where this profile, app, transaction list, blah. And you need to have just a particular flag on one of your sub-states to be sent to one of the components. That's what selector is for. You can create that super granular selector function which would get that particular flag, and it would propagate all the way to the component or anywhere you want to listen to it, and it's going to be an observable which you subscribe to, right? And then it changes every time your store is changed. That's what selector is for. And affix, right? Again, that fancy line to identify that it's kind of like outside of these three, but still pretty close. And I know, again, language issues. For some reason, I used to always call them affects, even though it's a fact, and even in Ukrainian and Russian language, which are my native, it's effect. So I don't know why it was called an affect, but anyways. That's something which, it's a stream. If you guys are familiar with RxJS, it's just a stream of RxJS operators which make side effects management easy, cleaner, I guess, if you really reactive approach fan, which again, opinionated. But I started using it and I like it. It's kind of hard to start using it though. Again, for people who probably don't really understand how all these things work together, I made this super fancy diagram. Took me forever. Not because, I guess because of the PowerPoint, it's just like all this animation, but anyways, component, right? It's, in this particular case, I took component. It can be like a guard if you like guards in your application. This is where we dispatch actions for load the data for that particular component which is guarded by the guard. This can be service. So it dispatches an action, a particular command, an event, which is going to be consumed later by, we're going to get that later, but it has particular instructions or payload for a recipient, which based on that and based on the action type it knows what it needs to perform with the reducer, with a state, right? Normally, if you don't have effects, it is directly received by a reducer, right? Reducer is just simple function, which in older versions of NgRx, it was just a simple switch with a bunch of cases where each case is listening to a particular action. Now in NgRx 8.0, they added another layer of abstraction for create reducer, where you call the create reducer function, where you kind of stack all these types of actions, and you have a callback for each action, which makes it probably a little bit smaller. So that's the way they do it now. And after reducer reduces the state, it lands in the state, right? So your state is updated. And then the way to know about that update is to use a selector, which goes back to component, right? So we have this unidirectional flow always from component, action reducer state, using selector back to component again. Now it's all cool if you, let's say, just need to set some flag or something easy and small on your UI application, which doesn't touch the API or server or anything, which needs to have a side effect. Again, for this reason, there is effects. Basically, what happens when action is dispatched and it's received by a reducer first, and then after that, effect can listen to that same action, and it can catch that action in the stream. I'll show you in the code how we do it in older versions of NgRx. Then that effect can catch that action and can do anything which you can imagine doing in that side effects, because it doesn't need to be a pure function. So you can connect to the service, like your REST client, which then communicates to the server and goes back, or you can redirect your person somewhere else, or you can just do some computation, heavy logic, or some screen, anything. And after that, when service is done working with your request and it has a response back, effect dispatches another action which lands in the reducer with that new data. So again, let's say I have a load action type. It is dispatched by component, it goes in the reducer, it changes the reducer with some particular flag, let's say is loading, to indicate that it's loading, right? So that based on that flag you can tell, okay, I can show loading indicator, right? It says it is loading for fraction of a second, but still it's important. It may take longer, right? So you never know. It goes to effect then. Effect catches that load action and it knows, okay, if somebody tries to load, then I need to call backend for it, right? Because we need to load stuff. And then effect has another action dispatched, or basically it goes to the service and it calls the query method to get the data. It comes back, then it dispatches the load success action and inserts uses the input of the server response data to send it to reducer. So that reducer unsets the flag of the is loading because it's not loading anymore, and sets the collection data to what that action payload is. So pretty simple when you look at this diagram. Okay, so some code. It's maybe not super fancy, but it was kind of hard for me to. I couldn't create anything. Just anyways, basically, first question is how do you want to organize your code, right, in your application? Since AngularJS, there was always kind of like these two approaches, right, where you go by feature or you go by like a type of your file. So let's say you have a profile, then it's going to have all the component services, blah, blah, blah. Or you can organize like components, all components for your application services, all services. I think in Angular 2, they came up like with that one way of doing things, I think. So at least we do it, we create like a little component, and then component has TS, JS, and all that stuff, and this SCSS. But when it comes to NgRx, it's really up to you. You can kind of group it with, if you have a reducer and you have a model for that component, like an interface, you can move it there. We have like a centralized store folder where we have store/reducers, store/actions, store/effects. We did it in this way, and it seems to be fine. The main file, which is called index.ts, it has an interface for your app store. That's like a state of your application with the substates. So we have like 6, and then each state, it has a reducer for that state, so that you kind of organize it this way, where you say which the state name is and which reducer is for that state. And then in your app module, main module, you just in the bootstrap process, right? You just say, I want my reducers to be loaded for store module, and then if you have effects, you just load them there that way. This probably stayed the same way in Angular 8. I didn't check it yet, but in 7 certainly it still works this way. Okay, so actions, right? A lot of people, when it comes to NgRx, they complain about boilerplate, right? A lot of stuff needs to be written upfront in order to make simple things work. So NgRx team tried to fight, and they came up with, at least for for creating actions, they came up with a create action factory function, which that's old way. You create a class for each action with a type, and then if you have a payload, you need to implement an interface with a payload, and you need to pass it. And you have a constructor function, which you say, okay, if for this private property payload, it's going to be that error. And then you need to export all these types, so that in reducer you can check the types of these actions, right? A newer way is in NgRx 8, you use create action, and you just set the type, and then you set the payload if it has a payload. I didn't have the slide for it because it was kind of, we didn't use, we didn't update yet to NgRx, so I can't really talk about that a lot. Okay, so the main reducer, it's not the main, it's just like the one which probably the easier to talk about is app. So app is something which is global, right? Anything which happens to the user in the app is stored in the app like in the app state. Any errors, global app errors, or anything like that is stored in the app state, right? And this is extremely simplified. I needed to like a little bit rearrange the code before I could externally present on it. So. But you get the idea, right? We have few flags here. As I said, it's initialized or initialized, and then there is error, right? If something happened, and then this is the default state. We just set it to false, and then this is the reducer, right? As I said, simple switch. It listens for particular actions, and then it's setting flags which make sense for that particular action. So if you initialize, it will say, I am initializing right now. And then if it's success, then it says it's done initializing, it's initialized already. And then if it's a failure, then it has some kind of failure and error code back, and then you always reduce your state and you return it. Again, when I was talking about actions, I'm not sure how you guys do it, you guys which use NgRx right now, but we have some kind of this convention where every action, if it communicates with the backend, it always has success and failure action. So it always pessimistic or optimistic result, right? It always may result in an error, and if there is one, then it will be caught, and this action underscore failure will be dispatched with that action with that payload, which is error, to save that in the state. And then you can show it in your UI, or you can log it or something, depends, right? Okay, app affect. Again, simple stream. In Reks.js 6, they came up with this pipe which has all these operators in there, comma separated. So when off type means, okay, when this action is dispatched, I want to dispatch a new action. So basically what it says, when app action is trying to initialize, I want my profile to be loaded. So it means that, okay, app is initializing, first thing I need to do is to load my profile. And that's what that affect is doing. And now if you go look at profile effect, it looks, okay, if somebody, it doesn't care what called it, but if this is called, I want to call my profile resource, that we call resource the REST client to communicate with the backend. I want to get it, and if map, it normally, if HTTP error code is 200, right, I want to dispatch a new action which is called load success, but in case of error, it's going to be observable of failure. And then again, in load success, when that, right, load success action called, I want to initialize success action of app action, right? So basically it starts here, goes all the way here, and then comes back here. So app is initialized, then we load our profile. If it's success, then app is initialized. Otherwise, there is an error. Here there was some bootstrapping for like connection to the WebSocket and stuff, so it was not related to the effect. Again, a little bit back to index. I want to talk a little bit about the selectors, right? These are really powerful functions. Again, pure functions, easy to test, and it's a little bit kind of confusing when you look at it. But then, essentially, what it's doing, it has number of input params, right? And it always, both of them, like all of them are functions, but what it does, it creates a slice from first one. You see if get apps, sorry, there is a typo, get app state, it gets the state app, so the sub state called app, and then after that it gets the error, but not from the state, but from the actual substate. So it kind of like combines all these selectors and creates a new selector. So it's pretty handy, once you wrap your mind around it. And then why I'm showing this example is pretty useful to show in the loading indicators, right? As I said, then there is a little bit, it's not complicated, but a little bit different way of creating a selector where you actually, the third param is resolved data for these two selectors, right? So these two guys are booleans, right? So whenever they are ready, I am listening to this get loaded indicator in my app component, and whenever this returns true, I show it. Whenever it doesn't, it's hidden. So I only care if app is not initialized and it's not resulted in the error, then I want to show the loading indicator. Okay, I was talking about the guards, right? The way we do it, we use guards in order to prevent the component loading before the data is ready, so that you don't end up like with, empty, broken interface, or like, there are other ways to do it, but we decided to use guards at the very beginning, so it kind of works fine. And the way you use it, it's you define it in your route, and you have this guard, right? And the way we do it, at the very top, it's called this store dispatch, right? When the implementation of the guard, and it is calling the load action. As I showed you in the affect, all that stuff happens, right? It communicates with the backend, gets the response, and then the next line, what it's doing, you see that select? It means that I want to select that value from my store, but it's an observable, right? It's not going to be there immediately, but whenever it is, I want to filter it by flag loaded. And if that flag is set to true, this will return the observable of Boolean, so that it means that, okay, now I'm ready to load my guard, to load my component, right? So guard helps. Like it basically handles the this asynchronous flow in a really nice and clean way, I think. Okay, so in transaction component, where we have our internal clients, they're acting on this. We have buttons for accept and reject for every transaction, right? So they choose what they want based on the request, based on the data the external clients provide. So this is pretty simplified, but the idea is for each button press, we massage the data based on what callback is saying, and then we dispatch an action to either create payload. It means it issues the post request, and on accept and on cancel, it issues the put request to update existing resource. And the wrapper component, it's all about those dumb and smart components, but I just wanted you to show the idea how you subscribe to the data, which after dispatch it flows back to your component, right? So you always have this reactive way of listening to updates. You don't need to fetch and try to get the data every time you need it. You just subscribe to it, and it's going to be always thrown your way when it's available. So we have this selector called get transaction entities, which gets the state, and then the subslice of that state is dot entities, which is just an array of a collection of objects. And then you see this get transaction entities. We have a getter, simple getter, where you create observable of transaction array, and you select from that selector, which is observable, and then that is just a simple input param, transactions $, which is like convention for observables. Use async pipe so that it resolves when it's ready, and it's just the array of objects in your transaction list component, which is that's why it's super cool and efficient when you use the push strategy, on push change detection strategy. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, guys. You can follow me on Twitter if you liked my talk, and you can ask me now any questions or anything you need with NgRx. You can DM me, and I always happy to help.
Do you ever use selectors directly in your presentation components, or do you prefer pushing state down from the smart components?
That's what I do, the second option. I don't know, we adapted that approach from the very beginning. It seems just cleaner to me. I like to use the sync pipe more. I just don't like to pollute my constructors or on ng on init, because you need to subscribe and you need to have that in there. From any other standpoint but aesthetic, I can't tell you if it's more performant or not. I think it's probably the same. It's just people prefer one thing over the other. It's just that convention, right? Dumb smart components. I kind of believe in that.
With the pipe async, you also don't have to handle unsubscribe.
Unsubscribe. You don't need to destroy your observable if you use async. Yeah, that's true too.
Have you ever run into any issues where you're trying to dispatch too many actions right after another and some of them don't actually get dispatched? There's like a certain threshold with dispatching actions where you can't do it like inside of a for loop.
We had similar problem. So you almost talk about that debounce time solution where you want to kind of debounce to not let.
Debounce, but maybe delay by, because you want to be able to dispatch all the actions.
So we don't have that much of like a load where you have like hundreds of actions dispatched at the same time. Probably not, but what we had a problem with, and I forget. So basically, there is this concept of switch map versus merge map in RxJS, and what was happening, and like correct me if I'm wrong, I think switch map always switches the context if the previous observable is not. So basically, let's say there's two actions. First one is dispatched, and the other one dispatched right away after that. And let's say these are two synchronous, and they need to communicate with the backend. And response for the first one is not received yet, but the second one is issued. So switch map will throw this away. It will get the second one. But merge map, it will always have this sequence of actions preserved, so that, and again, I may be think because this, RxJS and naming is crazy. So basically, we were losing that previous actions were happening so often. We were losing the context of the previous because the second one was overriding the result of the first one. So merge map helped us to collect all the results from the actions in the way they were dispatched in that order. But with your, I'm not sure, is it just the actions are lost or?
Yes, actually, that's exactly, it's the same type of, it's actually not, I think it's like an exhaust map where only the first action went through and the rest don't go through. Like, it's because you're, executing these dispatches inside of a for loop. So the way that I got around.
Maybe that's the thing with switch map versus merge map. Did you?
It's not. So what I did was that I was able to break down into use a concat map to keep them ordered, and then broke the array out into a from.
Okay.
Cat map, and then from that array, and then added a small delay between them.
So that's how you fixed it?
Yeah, that's the only way I could fix it, because otherwise they were attempting.
And what was the nature of that action dispatching? Why was happening so often?
We had a certain amount of breadcrumbs in our trail that we were trying to update, and even just down to two actions. So it knew that there was a root breadcrumb and then another breadcrumb or two based on the path that we took through our routing, and wanted to update the state to store breadcrumbs in a global area so we could display it in the title bar, and it wasn't dispatching the second appending of the breadcrumb. It got the root one and then nothing else. And it was indeterminate too. I'd refresh and sometimes it would dispatch and sometimes it wouldn't. So adding a small delay in the string.
Interesting. Did you have an effect for those guys? It was just directly to reducer, and reducer wasn't catching those?
Exactly.
Interesting. I know, like with effects, it can be tricky when you like have communication with the server, it can like go out of the sync. But yeah, interesting. It's probably need, yeah, looking at the code probably could give more clue.
So I'm just trying to get up to speed with NgRx. The relationship between component, the effect, and the store, right? So
Action, reducer, and
right, so,
effect.
So my question is, when you have a component, you want to know you want to do an asynchronous call using the effect. The question is it better to call the effect from a component or call the store from a component and have the effect, have the asynchronous call back when it gets back, then call something again in the store to update the component. So from a component, if you know it's going to be asynchronous, so should the component call the effect directly or call the store directly and that store calls the effect?
You see, any action which gets dispatched, it always lands in the store, in the reducer. Always goes there first. An effect after that can catch it. You may not handle it in your reducer. You may not have that switch case for that reducer, and it's totally fine. You don't need it, right? But always, effect itself cannot initiate any action. It always there, kind of in a listening mode to intercept things and act on those based on the, business logic you have or anything else. So, again. Maybe I'm not getting completely your question, but it looks like you don't know what needs to originate the action, effect versus component. That was the question?
Well, kind of from the component. Let's say I know I need to do an action that's asynchronous, call up the server.
Okay.
So should the component take a dependency on the effect, and so I'll call something to the effect, and that effect basically works to the store, or should the component talk to the store directly? And that store.
Yeah, you see, it's designed in a way that these three things they don't know about existing of each other. They're completely decoupled. So whenever you dispatch an action, these two guys are listening to it, right? If they don't listen to it, nothing happens. You may dispatch an action and nobody will know about it because they never subscribe to it. So whenever you dispatch an action from component, first thing you may directly catch it in your reducer. If it doesn't have any side effects, you just need to do something, right? If that action had some kind of payload right from the component. And the second thing, your effect can listen to that particular action and communicate with the server, let's say, if you need that, right? And then after that, when server has a response, then it sends another action then which will land in reducer. That's kind of the flow is, right? So it always goes through the action to reducer. Effect itself, it doesn't change the state. It just has all this back and forth actions intermingled between each other to, like we have, before we went to with WebSockets, we have a polling solution, right? Where we had effect which was managing polling every like 5 seconds or something, and then this was like whole sequence of effects. Polling happens, there is data, send the data back to reducer, and like all that kind of like really not complicated but really like nasty, a lot of side effects stuff, right? All that was happening in effect, but when it comes to reducer, there is this object, it's sent to reducer. All reducer knows it needs to take this and do something with it with current state, either update, delete, clear, something like that. Does that make sense?
I think the direct answer to your question is that you always have to dispatch an action. And the action, based on what the action is, then it's decided whether we handle the new reducer or go to your effect or both.
Okay. You can't call it effect directly. Okay, so that's the answer to the part. So you should call it effect directly. You should always go to an action to the store. If that needs an effect, fine, we'll do it.
Yeah, you may not need an effect, yeah. Right?
Okay.
It's
so that's the exact word for it, is that you're saying that you can't call it effect. Okay.
You don't call effect.
Okay.
Effect is subscribed to the action, but you cannot call effect. Effect is listening, and then it does something based on that stream of data which it gets.
Okay.
So yeah, you don't couple action with effect. Yeah, for people who like completely new to NgRx, did it make any sense for you? Like, did it like make you like it,
Well,
hate it?
I've worked with Redux before, so it's kind of the same.
Well, for you, yeah, it's okay. Well, it looks like all the NgRx experts here, so I hope I didn't waste your hour of your time, guys.
Excellent.
All right, well, if we don't have any other questions, let's give Evgeny another round of applause.
Thank you.